مساء الخير جميعا. شكرا على حضوركم. It's my utmost pleasure to introduce tonight to you our wonderful speaker, Manoela Looka-Dátsiyo. Manoela Looka-Dátsiyo is an architect and one of the incredible forces behind the success of the Venice Art and Architecture Biennale. Manoela holds a degree in architecture from the University of Naples and a PhD in history of architecture from the University of Roma-Kyieti. She has been an honorary professor at the Tongji University in Shanghai since 2023. She was the executive director of the Visual Arts and Architecture Department of the Venice Biennale, where she was instrumental in shaping the direction and delivery of the Biennale since 2009, which is coincidentally the year where Her Excellency Sheikh Hamay and myself had the honor of first meeting Manoela at the Biennale when we met her and President Barata when Bahrain was interested in first participating in the Biennale. And I think this is one of the most beautiful things of the Biennale is that they are welcoming, curious, and open to all countries, independent of their size or stature. And I think this is one of the reasons that the Biennale has been such a beautiful melting pot of ideas and exchange and culture throughout the years. And I think a lot of it has to do with the work that Manoela has been doing there. I always think that the most successful curators and directors are the ones who have an invisible hand in shaping the direction of institutions. And Manoela has definitely been that invisible shaping all the successful editions that we've seen in the Biennale. Each one different than the other, but each one completing a very important page in the history of architecture. Today, since 2002, Manoela is directing the Britzker Prize for Architecture, the most prestigious prize of architecture, I can say. I think this without a doubt. And she has only been there for 3 years, but we can already see the effect that she is having on the Britzker Architecture Prize, and that I personally very much look forward to see how you continue playing such an important role in shaping the discourse and anticipating the future course of architecture. So thank you very much, Manoela, for being here with us today, and we all look very much forward to hearing about your experience in the Biennale. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Noura. It's a very special pleasure for me to be here today. And I'm so grateful to you all for being here. I'm grateful to Noura and Sheikh Hamay. I mean, this is really like a long time collaboration, ongoing collaboration, and allow me to say friendship. And I'm so very grateful that finally today I'm in Bahrain. So let me start by saying that this conversation has two different and yet very deeply intertwined focuses. One is exhibiting architecture, which is by itself a theme, and the international architecture exhibitions of the Venice Biennale. I want to start by saying that the Venice Biennale as an institution cannot be understood other than within the wider frame of the city of Venice. And this is not meant to be an historical introduction. I'm not an architecture nor a Biennale historian. I'm just someone who has been always hands-on things for many years. But it's to explain why the mother of all biennales, so the oldest and most important relevant example of cultural diplomacy and international platform for the arts, was conceived in Venice and not in Rome or Torino or any other city in Italy. Venice, historically, politically, commercially, has always been a bridge between the East and West, as well as between the North and South. And through pragmatism, business skills, and diplomacy, the Venetian Republic already emerged in the 14th century as the most powerful Western trading partner along the Silk Road. And as a result, we can see that at the end, at the fall of the Byzantine Empire, Venice became itself a vast commercial empire, expanding its network through the whole Mediterranean and all the way to the Black Sea. And this was achieved by overcoming religious, political, philosophical divergences and establishing communities in the main cities of the Near East, as well as welcoming permanent, let's call them embassies from those same countries to Venice. These were very special institutions called fondaco. Fondaco, which is the name of this type of building, the fondaco is more a hub than a warehouse. And it was part of a most efficient Venetian infrastructure system that was conceived for trades and exchange. Here you have the three examples that the Venetian Republic built along the Grand Canal. The fondaco of the Turks, of the Germans, and of the Persians. The Turks, of course, they represent all the incredible trading volume that Venice had with the whole Muslim world. The Germans represent the very intense trade that Venice had with all the northern European countries. And the Persians represent the very strong link that Persia had with Venice in terms of textile and fabric trade. And I'm showing you these buildings. By the way, one of them, the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, has been recently renovated by an incredible intervention by Rem Koolhaas. In more recent years, and in much the same spirit and centuries later, the Biennale was born exactly with the same ambition to create a totally international platform for the cultural exchange, but consistently rooted in the very specific identity of the city of Venice. So since the very beginning, the Biennale embodies, in a way, the Biennale case shows the importance of the balance between the global and local dimensions from, let's say, according to the three main parameters that are logistic, touristic, and cultural infrastructure. And this has attracted a lot of private and public institutions to establish themselves around the Venice Biennale. This is why I think that the equivalent, the contemporary Fondaco, although in a cultural perspective, is what you see today. You have, for instance, the Fondazione Prada that occupies now Ca Cornel della Regina, the palazzo of the former Queen of Cyprus, Pinot Collection hosted in Palazzo Grassi and Punta della Dogana, or the Bergruen Art and Culture Foundation in Palazzo Diedo, and many, many other institutions. So since the first edition and throughout its 130 years of history, the Venice Biennale has always represented a privileged vantage point from which to look at the state of the world and the changes in society, other than a meeting ground between all the arts. And the task of the Biennale in these 130 years, which is to promote the avant-garde and the tendencies, the new tendencies in all artistic disciplines, hasn't changed, but inevitably it has rather expanded to include progressively and throughout the years after the first edition of the Art Biennale in 1895, music, cinema, theater, architecture, and dance. But how to create the institution's identity in those years, in 1895, within the Venetian context that was very precisely characterized? The first and clear sign that a new institution was born was given through architecture. So the first act, the very first act, was to build a new pavilion. The so-called central pavilion that here you can see in its construction phase and then throughout the different stages all the way to the actual one. And this was built in the gardens that you can see in the bottom part of the images that were created by Napoleon in the 19th century. Later on, the Biennale started to progressively expand in the long abandoned building of the Arsenale. First in 1980, the Corderie that you can see in the central part of the image, and then from 1999 until the present date, through a long-term and ongoing restoration plan, all the other buildings and areas that were situated in the unused portion of the Arsenale. And the idea, of course, was to create more exhibition space for the curators, as well as for the growing number of national pavilions. And what Noura mentioned is definitely very important, because on the occasion of the first edition of the Venice Biennale in 1895, artists from 15 countries were invited to participate and hosted in the Central Pavilion. That was the only one building existing. But very soon, given the huge success of the initiative, more and more countries started to demand, to request, to develop their own participations autonomously. So Belgium was the first pavilion to open in 1907, followed by Hungary, Bavaria, now Germany, UK, France, and so on and so forth. And of course, to the point to have, nearly 30 pavilions in the Giardini. Of course, this soft power is a currency of immense value that can alter international perceptions, that can build bridges, that can foster diplomatic relations in ways that traditional political discourse sometimes cannot. And through the decades, for all these reasons, more and more countries, and for the most diverse motivations, believe you me, have decided to be represented at the Venice Biennale stage, so gradually occupying the Giardini and later on the Arsenale, and more spaces in the city, to the point to reach the record number of 90 participating countries in 2019 for art, and 66 this year for the architecture. So let's now focus a bit more on the international architecture exhibition, because each Biennale is the result of two completely different but synergetic forces in actions. One is the overall strategy of the Biennale president, who embodies the whole institution, and the artistic vision of the Biennale curator on the other side in terms of message and its representation. And here I'm showing you what I call the family portrait of the Architecture Biennale. This is a long sequence of Biennale presidents from 74 until 2025. And then in the other part, you can see all the Biennale curators, architecture curators from 74 again until 2025. And the reason why some are in black and white and some are in color is that I just wanted to differentiate the long sequence, the portraits in color of presidents and curators with whom I had the pleasure and also the privilege to work together. I arrived at the Biennale in 1909, but my first architecture Biennale was 2000 with Massimiliano Fuchsat. And I arrived in a most interesting moment when the institution was changing its format from a public institution to some kind of private, semi-private foundation. So the whole structure of the Biennale was to be reorganized and made more efficient. And so I had the chance to rethink the way that both art and architecture exhibitions were organized, and to kind of reshape the internal organization, which was a huge challenge, but also a huge occasion for someone who is passionate to this work. And my role, the way I interpret it, towards these curators and artists and architects coming every year and national pavilions, the way I interpreted my role was precisely to create a bridge between the institution and all the people who, for different reasons, were coming to bring their expertise, their art, their architecture, their talent to such an international stage with such a pressure and a challenge. So I felt a little bit like in a sandwich, squeezed between the institution and our guests, because for me it's like a huge family, sometimes coming back. So to stretch the rules of the institution in a way that could allow the curators and the participants to realize their own projects. Of course, something very easy to say, way less easy to achieve, but a great challenge. And talking about exhibiting architecture for a moment, as we know, this is already a paradox by itself, because the finished work of an architect, meaning an actual building in its specific context, is almost always absent, unlike the art works. So behind architecture, there is a whole urban and social context that has been affected by the presence of a new building. And to represent this context and the reactions of the people who engage with it is, of course, extremely important. And also we must remember that the very fact of moving architecture into an exhibition space is already a transformation of the structure. So to get around the absence of the finished work, there are, of course, many different ways. We can represent projects in secondary forms, like models or drawings or photographs, or more recently, digital media. Or we can display mock-ups and duplicated fractions of the original buildings for people to experience and walk through. Or even the lighting, humidity, airflow conditions can be manipulated and recreated through interactive installations. Or we can focus and trigger on the macro environment, from geoeconomic landscape to political and social reality. And all these are ways that have been partly or fully adopted by the Biennale curators in their own exhibition projects, and we are going to see how. So now let's start our quick walk through the different editions of the Venice Biennale. I think we can identify a first chapter that goes from 68 until 98, and that I subtitled From First Architecture Display to Digital Era. It's a long time span, but it's interesting to see how this idea of exhibiting architecture evolved. The very first, let's say, display of architecture within the Venice Biennale happened in 1968, and it happened as one room within the Art Biennale. Quite interesting that it was not a real architecture exhibition. It was curated by Carlo Scarpa, the Venetian architect. Here you can see the plan and some images of the exhibited works, and within a single space that he laid out himself, the work of artists, photographers, set designers, graphic designers, ceramists, and of course architects was brought together in order to achieve the integration between various artistic practices that was deeply rooted in the nature of the institution. Then in 74, Carlo Ripa di Meana was a politician, became Biennale president, and it was the beginning of a new phase for the Biennale, based on a democratic and anti-fascist culture that had been brought up by the student revolution in 68. And with Ripa di Meana, the Biennale gives voice to the themes of its time, and not just representing or documenting, but for the first time also producing culture. So just to give you a bigger picture, the art exhibition was on hold until 76. Theater and cinema events were held in 74 and 75 under the title Freedom for Chile. This was a huge protest against the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. And then in 77, the so-called dissident Biennale took place in openly criticizing what was happening in the former USSR, and in open, let's say, controversy with the Italian left-wing party, to the point that Carlo Ripa di Meana had to resign. Vittorio Gregotti was appointed at some point in 75 director of the art and architecture department of the Biennale, so it was still one exhibition. And following and fostering this interdisciplinary nature of the Biennale, he decided to expand the existing exhibition format and also include other disciplines, among which architecture. So a proposito del Mulino Stucchi was the kind of first architectural presence. He organized a competition, engaged a group of artists and architects to explore possible reuses for this ruinous Mulino Stucchi that was a neo-Gothic industrial landmark on the Giudecca Island. And at the same time, he invited Harald Zeman to curate the legendary Macchine Celebi exhibition at the Magazzini del Sale. The second edition in 76 was still curated by Gregotti, and for the first time, the Venice Biennale had a common theme that was declined through the two disciplines. For art, Germano Celant was curating his exhibition at the Central Pavilion, and for architecture, actually, Vittorio Gregotti proposed a triptych of exhibitions, the most important one being Europa America, organized in collaboration with his American counterpart, Peter Eisenman. And this was aimed to stage a confrontation between European and American visions of the city, so historical city centers in the case of Europe, and urban expansion into the suburbs in the case of America. But this Europa America exhibition is very important because not only it is a major contribution to to internationalize the Italian architectural debate through exhibitions, but also because it shows the power of exhibitions as amplifiers and how this conferred to architecture the same space as relevance of the visual arts for the first time. And the third exhibition curated by Gregotti in '78, it's kind of the conclusion of this triptych of exhibitions. So the existing photographs, they don't really document too extensively, but we know that it was a mix, again, of art and architecture. The way architecture was displayed was mainly through models and drawings, although there were many presences, many installations by artists in a way that we would now call more related to, if not architecture, but land art. Then in '78, Giuseppe Galasso, another politician, became Biennale president. And the principle was laid down whereby each of the artistic sectors were to have a separate and distinguished permanent director to organize the activities. So the Biennale took the structure that is more similar to what we know now. So he appointed Paolo Portoghesi to curate the first international edition of the architecture exhibition titled La presenza del passato. Portoghesi had a very precise idea, and his idea was not to show images of architecture, but real architecture. And as he used to say, architecture is not for architects, it's for the public. So compared to Gregotti, Paolo Portoghesi chooses to have a way more popular approach, so how to make architecture a bit more accessible to the public. And he anticipated the inauguration of his first international exhibition by entrusting Aldo Rossi in '79 with the realization of the legendary floating Teatro del Mondo. And in this way, he started a dialogue with the city, and also what we would now call a promotional communication strategy that culminated with the much celebrated Strada Novissima. But this was a very brilliant way to turn architecture into a theme of public debate, because this theater was moored near the Punta della Dogana for months. It was hosting theater activities, performances, and debates. So through, let's say, making architecture more like a spectacle and a festival and more accessible to the public. And he also commissioned Aldo Rossi to design the gateway to the Arsenale for his 1980 exhibition, always following the idea that he wanted to have real architecture displayed. And finally, the Strada Novissima, which was probably the most famous element of his own 1980 exhibition. It was conceived as a theater wings for a hypothetical postmodern street, and designed by 20 architects. You can see here all the names, and these are the most famous names that you can imagine, from Frank Gehry to Rem Koolhaas to Arata Isozaki, each of them presenting their own work behind their respective facades. And these are images of the built facades. So other than a consideration to the postmodernist movement, the first international architecture exhibition is definitely a way out from the traditional representation of architecture through models and drawings, and also a way to let a wider public experience architecture in its very real form. The second edition was always curated by Portoghesi, and it's titled architecture in Islamic countries. And we must not forget that Portoghesi had just completed the competition for the Islamic mosque in Rome in 74. So this second edition raises, interestingly enough, questions about postmodernity throughout realms that extend south and east from the Mediterranean, where modernity and decolonization were converging in those times. Portoghesi calls the attention to the strengthening influence of Islamic culture, proposing an overview of architecture in Islamic countries. So you can see here some images of his homage to Hassan Fatih, Comrade Diba, Riccardo Bofill, and Skidmore Owings and Merrill. And then he changed his role, and from curator he became president of the Biennale from 1984 to 1992, so quite a long presidency. And in his tenure as chairman of the Biennale, Portoghesi followed the same spirit behind his exhibitions. Well, of course, with a change in curatorship. He appointed Aldo Rossi to curate the third and fourth edition, and later on Francesco Dalcò, who represents also a further shift in the exhibition format. The idea also in the choice of the art curator is always that, let's say, to look at the past as inspiration for the present. And with this spirit, Aldo Rossi displayed his first Biennale project, Progetto Venezia. For him, architecture is the engine behind urban transformation, and the Biennale allows him to overcome the strada novissima that will be, I can tell you, the obsession of every curator of an architecture Biennale. Strada novissima stayed the reference forever, in the negative or positive way, but every single curator confronted himself or herself with that. So in the case of Aldo Rossi, no selection of works by masters, but rather an open competition / exhibition, and a focus on two major themes: the priority given to the phase of planning, and also the requalification and transformation of specific areas of Venice and surrounding. And it was a very successful edition, over 1,500 applicants, emerging and as well as affirmed architects, took Rossi's invitation to participate in Progetto Venezia and reinvent parts of the city. Needless to say, the theme that drew the most interest was the challenge to redesign the famous Accademia Bridge on the Grand Canal. And here you can see some of the most creative proposals. An international jury was appointed for the very first time, and to select the best projects on display. And we had architects like Robert Venturi, Denise Scott Brown, Daniel Libeskind, and Peter Eisenman presented with the stone lions that was specifically designed by Aldo Rossi for this edition. You can see the sketch and some images of the installation. So all in all, even though Venice was in those times quite an anti-modern city in its culture, the Aldo Rossi's Biennale was very well attended and captured the interests of many. The second edition, curated by Aldo Rossi, was a completely different one. It was dedicated to Berlage, and going back into the idea that it's imperative to look at buildings and its history, and contemporary architecture should keep up with the past. So this was a way more traditional exhibition exhibiting the body of work of the Dutch architect. Then in 91, Portoghesi appointed Francesco Dalcò. This is a very important turning point because Dalcò was a committed proponent of developing the Biennale's internationality. He chooses to model the Architecture Biennale after the art one. So he invited all the national pavilions to participate. He didn't curate the pavilions directly, but he was heavily involved in the choice of the curators and the participants. So we had people of the like of Ko Pimmelblau representing Austria, or Peter Eisenman and Frank Gehry representing United States, Herzog de Meuron representing Switzerland, and so on. And for the main exhibition, Dalcò organizes a series of initiatives that were linking the specificity of the Venetian context to a more international debate, always this relation between the local and global perspectives. So he organized the competition for the new Palazzo del Cinema at the Lido di Venezia. It was won by Moneo but not realized. A competition for the Italian pavilion at Giardini that was won by Francesco Cellini. Also this is a bit of an Italian story, it was not realized. A competition for a gateway to Venice of the whole area of Piazzale Roma, again not realized. And then Premio Venezia for international universities in the Arsenale. But next to all these initiatives, he also promoted the construction of the Sterling Pavilion, which is still there, as the book pavilion at the Giardini. Dalcò used to say, and is still now claims that it was his merit to bring new energies in improving the Giardini area. The bookshop by Sterling was supposed to become a similar kind of event to the Aldo Rossi's Teatro del Mondo, but as Francesco still says and claims to his merit, the bookshop was not a temporary building, but is still there as permanent memory of his Biennale. And he also commissioned Massimo Scolari to build this temporary gateway to the Arsenale that then was relocated on the roof of the Architecture University, and Aldo Rossi to design another gateway to the Giardini. And then Gianluigi Rondi became president, appointed in 1993, and he was, under his presidency, there was the 100th anniversary of the institution. So he was in charge of celebrating the 100th year of the Venice Biennale. He promoted a workshop, and he nominated the new artistic directors of all the disciplines. I'm mentioning their names: Luis Pascual from Spain for theater, Jean Clair from France for visual arts, Anne Solijn from Austria for architecture, Mario Messinis for music, and Gillo Pontecorvo for cinema. And I'm mentioning this because for the first time, the Venice Biennale, in the Biennale history, the artistic directors were chosen among international personalities. So the international dimension of the Biennale expanded even further. And Anne Solijn was called to curate the 1996 edition titled Sensors of the Future. That was the conclusion of the centenary celebrations activities. Anne Solijn confirmed Francesco Dalcò the new format, and he also invited the countries to participate. But the main exhibition in the Central Pavilion, as you can see from the images, stole the show. So he investigated the architect's ability to catch underground vibes of the present times and translate them into the future. So he invited 70 architects to exhibit one of their most significant projects as a sort of personal testament, not even following any theme, not even his own proposed theme. And he invited, in a section of emerging voices, people like Odile Decol, Dilare Scofidio, Peter Zumthor, or Kazuyo Sejima. And it was also the first time that Golden Lions, on the model of the film festival, were awarded to participants. You can see some of the images. The first Golden Lions from Lifetime Achievements were given to Ignazio Gardella, Philip Johnson, and Oscar Niemeyer. And the Japanese pavilion curated by Isozaki got the prize as the best national pavilion. And now we enter a second macro chapter of the Venice Biennale, Architecture Biennale. We can think of these 20 years of Architecture Biennale as some kind of slow pivot from the future city in the age of the internet to how societies live, struggle, and coexist. So from the optimism of the internet era age to the politics of society, where internet becomes less of a shiny theme and more like an invisible infrastructure in the background, while society, meaning who benefits, who is excluded, how do we share space, becomes like the center of the conversation. And in 1999, the Biennale changed its legal status. It becomes a foundation, and Paolo Baratta is the first manager to be appointed to chair an Italian cultural public institutions. This is also when I started my personal adventure with the Biennale. He decided to simplify the internal organization, start the transformation of the Biennale from a state-run public institution into a more efficient, semi-private organization. And with him, the Biennale became a truly international event. He changed the format of both the art and architecture exhibitions, replacing the usual thematic and retrospective type of exhibition with one main international exhibition curated by an international curator in dialogue with the national participations. He also planned the physical expansion of the Biennale venues, initiating the large-scale renovation that I told you about before, using the Arsenale spaces, and appointed Massimiliano Fuxas as the curator of the 2000 Biennale. Massimiliano, this is what how he used to start every single meeting that we have. He used to start by saying that he wanted architecture to be a response to the Art Biennale, because he was truly convinced that architecture is way more interesting than visual arts. He promoted a very first big turn. So he shifted the attention away from pure forms or from beautiful buildings, we can say, to what it means to live in the megalopolis of the third millennium. So globalization, migration, new communication technologies, planetary scale urbanization, and going beyond the specificity of architecture. He abandoned the usual setup and occupied, believe you me, more space than ever, using the Biennale as a sort of laboratory to analyze the new planetary dimension of urban behavior and transformations according to three main themes: environment, society, and technology. And he started to expand also in the exhibition spaces into the Arsenale. And my first experience, I must say, of working with a curator, any curator, I found out that it was always about, at a certain point, to get more space and to get more budget. This never changed throughout the decades. But what was really unprecedented was the way he used the Corderie building, the long Arsenale building. Of course, again, Portoghesi was once more a reference, so he revisited the continuous perspective of the Strada Novissima, but at the same time he created a very significant example of fusion between digital technology and architectural debate. It is very first time that we see such a massive presence of video and digital media to represent architecture, a brand new thing. So what you see now in this image is a nearly 300 meters long, 260 to be precise, projection screen. In order to do that, we had to find in those times something quite revolutionary. It was a fabric that could be stretched for 300 linear meters without gaps, without stitching, just a continuous flat projection surface for video projection. And at some point, this was almost like an artwork, because there were images of 12 contemporary megalopolis from all over the world, from Bogota to Buenos Aires, Bucharest, Budapest, etc., running through this screen, and from time to time as one continuous image. So the exhibition, let's say, we can say that cultural stereotype, touristic and economic flows, they were all mixed together in this projection as a big magma, as he used to call it. So it's a very early architectural reflection on what now we would call the networked city. In 2001, Baratta left in disagreement with the then Minister of Culture and is replaced by Franco Bernabé, another manager who stayed in charge for 2 years, and he continued the process of privatization of the Biennale through a more complex internal organizational models, and initiated a systematic research for partnership and private support, so seeing the Biennale as a specialized producer of cultural events. His cultural strategy derives from his approach as a stranger, as he would define himself, which he thinks can help to open up new energies. So Bernabé decides to make very precise choices, breaking up somehow the games as an outsider, as he would think of himself. He appointed Francesco Bonami for the art exhibition. He appointed Kurt Foster as curator of the future architecture edition, but also confirmed Dejan Sujic, who had already been appointed by Baratta for the 2002 edition. Dejan's Biennale is also a very special one, because in 2002, there had never been more work for architects. So this means that there was no avant-garde, and the future was already being built. So he structures the whole exhibition around very tidy and tightly organized thematic bits. So housing, museums, education, church and state, shopping, and so on, with a very modular, clear display and a modular graphic system. And Dejan basically seeks for answers to a very precise question. What will architecture be like in the near future? And this is communicated through, of course, drawings and models, but also material samples, mock-ups, new technologies, which convey in a very tangible way the impact that buildings will have on our environment in a very short time. This method makes of this Biennale almost a live feed of upcoming projects that were being built precisely in that moment. And also the show opened exactly 1 year after 9/11. So Dejan also throws a provocation for people to think about it. And the provocation was whether the large tower model was still alive. So he invited a group of architects to present large-scale models of skyscrapers in a section called the City of Towers, to highlight this new interest for the vertical expansion that began to occur, but was also questioned by the Twin Towers attack. Davide Croft succeeds Franco Bernabé. He is another manager, so he's a long series of managers running the Biennale with a different spirit, and he had the task to finalize the reformation of the institution, so creating strong links with Venice and its territory. He applied further changes to the organizational model. For the first time, he appointed 2 women to curate the Art Biennale in 2005, Rosa Martinez and Maria de Corral, and at the same time appointed Robert Storr to curate the 2007 Biennale. He confirmed Kurt Foster for the 2004 edition and chose Ricky Burdett for the next one. Kurt Foster realized that architecture was changing, becoming a new species itself, and this is why he decided to title his exhibition Metamorph. He decided to focus on metamorphosis in architecture, dictated and facilitated by new technologies and materials, of course, and he featured an asymptote-designed modular structure that symbolized the growing metamorphosis project. It was designed for the very first time in a Biennale exhibition using computer technology. And also it created in our technical office a huge challenge to realize these structures, because we had to develop like detailed drawings, find suppliers with this kind of 3D printing machineries that had never been used before. But the result was quite spectacular. Again, once more reference to the Strada Novissima, but if the Strada Novissima wanted to project the idea that architecture is made of many strands and textures. In this case, Foster created the impression of a whole ocean of possibilities coming to the eyes of the spectator. In the central pavilion, he devoted a section, this was more like a critical looking backwards, to 4 architects that from his point of view, profoundly changed the theoretical debate in the beginning of the 80s. Aldo Rossi and James Sterling on one side, and Peter Eisenman and Frank Gehry on the other side. So the internet isn't the subject anymore, but computational design culture, and enabled, of course, by digital networks, is what makes this new metamorphic architecture possible in Kurt Foster's vision. And Ricky Burdett is not a practicing architect. Ricky Burdett is the director of the London School of Economics City Department. So for the first time in the history of the Biennale, the focus is not architecture in terms of buildings, but the city. And Ricky's assumption was very simple. There is a fundamental link between the physical world and the social world, which plays out more in cities than in buildings. So he chooses 5 regions, and 5 regions of the world, each with 4 cities, and this would be the layout. But the big issue that we debated enormously during our meetings was how to make sure that this connects to architecture rather than social geography. And the most powerful decision, after many debates and exchange of ideas, was to show architecture mainly as large-scale images and projections. And this proved to be an incredibly powerful graphic instrument. Imagine an aerial image of Caracas rather than Shanghai at 5 meters, well lit, and this would really take people's breath away. So you can see, for instance, here on the facade of the central pavilion, a gigantic reproduction of the city of Shanghai. And there were basically, according to Ricky Burdett, there were 4 primary aspects to communicate: the density of population, the speed of urban change over time, and then issues of violence, crime and segregation, and issues of transportation and mobility. So all this had to be displayed in a way that could be accessible to professionals, but also to non-professionals. And for these reasons, he decided to occupy the whole building of the Corderie with interactive displays, and for the first time showing screening in real time of images coming from 16 big cities across Asia, America, Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean. And what was incredibly powerful is what you see in these photos, these sort of 3D models of density. These are nothing but styrofoam blocks, simply cut and very well lit, that were literally in a very efficient and effective way representing the density of the different cities that we live in. So this is a clear turn away from abstract future tech towards urban data and social conditions. So all of a sudden the topics were housing, infrastructure, transport, and segregation at the core of the Venice Biennale. In 2008, Baratta was appointed again president of the Biennale. You can see not only artists and architects come back, or countries, but also presidents sometimes. And this was a 4-year mandate that was renewed twice, allowing him to stay until 2019. So during his second and third mandate, Baratta develops and expands his initial program and vision for the Biennale. Basically, he thought that there is a big world with free artists and architects, and they're all choosing their own paths and their own method of creation. So the exhibition, both art and architecture, must convey a geographical pluralism that has nothing to do with national borders, currents, and movements. So the choice of the curators for both art and architecture exhibitions, was following this idea of the Biennale that had to become an international platform for cultural exchange and discussion, and a machine that creates curiosity and desire in the visitor more and more. In architecture in particular, Baratta restarted where he had stopped in 2002, and he identifies the new specific focus of study, which is the bridge between architecture and society. So he identified for the institution a pressing need for dialogue between architecture and its reference audience, be it individuals or institutions. And with this in mind, he appoints Aaron Betsky to curate the 2008 edition. Betsky had a very short time to develop his own exhibition project, but his assumption was very simple. It is basically impossible to make an exhibition of architecture, because what you end up doing in the end is having models or drawings of buildings that have basically nothing of the spatial sense of the real buildings. So what you want to do when you exhibit architecture is basically to have an experience of architecture. And so Betsky makes a very simple argument. Maybe the way to show architecture is not to show buildings. So his theme, that was out there, architecture beyond buildings, asks whether architecture is, what architecture is basically outside finished buildings. So the response by the participants happened through installations, landscapes, media, and temporary structures. Here you can see images of the Arsenale. This was a very special case. Frank Gehry was awarded the Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement, and this was a nightmare, kind of a nightmare for all of us, because his project only arrived 2 weeks before the opening of the exhibition. You can imagine he was the most important guest of the whole exhibition, and literally 2 weeks before the opening, I received 3 images, little JPEG of a tiny little model that he had prepared of this installation. No scale, no dimensions, no technical descriptions, nothing. So panic, and I had to hire a full-time, an engineer and an architect to develop all this. And we didn't have Zoom in those times, we had Skype. I was Skyping every night with LA, with his office, hoping that, you know, the definition of the screen, the colors, it would have been like the right finishing, the right cracking for the clay panels. I had to call and find in the month of August in Venice an expert in restoration, art restoration, to make these clay panels with the right cracking, the right colors. So we were all literally terrified by the moment Frank Gehry would have appeared to receive his Golden Lion. Because ultimately the result could have been completely wrong. But he arrived and he exploded in a huge smile, and he couldn't stop kissing and hugging all the workers that were still finishing, because we didn't make it to the opening day, so it was like a sort of performance of people putting clay shields in place until after the opening. And in the central pavilion, Betsky dedicated a section to more let's say, utopian experiments from the 70s. Kazuyo Sejima in 2010 was a completely different story. She frames architecture as the stage where people encounter each other, basically how space can choreograph bodies, views, light, thresholds. So this is, again, a further move from objects to relationships and atmospheres. Almost, we could say, the spatial equivalent of social networks. She doesn't want to overload the visitors with information that is, by the way, already available in the internet. But the most important thing for her is to meet people and to experience the project. So to have some kind of contact with the materials on display. She gave to each participant one space, She intentionally didn't build any infrastructure. She let them completely free to occupy those spaces and to create some sort of atmosphere with the materials available. So as a curator, she was rather focusing on the rhythm of the show more than creating conceptual connections. So she thought that we have to think about how to show architectural quality more than elements, physical elements. So it was a chance for less information and more feeling. Also, Sejima, who was, by the way, also the first woman director of the International Architecture Exhibitions, she invited all in all 44 architects, studios, artists, engineers to present their work in a completely independent way, to reveal their personal response to the theme, but also to allow the exhibition to be presented through multiple points of view rather than a single orientation. And this also gave the visitors, both professional and not, the possibility to experience the manifold possibilities of architecture and this plurality of approaches. Here you can see Rem Koolhaas receiving his Golden Lion for lifetime achievement, but also there was another Golden Lion that was, yes, very deserved applause. Reclaim was the national participation of the Kingdom of Bahrain that marked the first participation of a Gulf state and also the first Golden Lion as the best national participation. I'm sure that almost all of you will have seen physically or in photographs these three fishermen's houses beautifully displayed that symbolize really the most powerful way to address the issues that architecture was going through at that date in a way that was clearly inspired by the current state of things here in Bahrain, also in view to stimulate a debate on future planning, but also transferred to a totally global stage by these two outstanding minds and persons that you see smiling and holding the Golden Lion, Sheikh Amay and Noura. The next edition was curated by David Chipperfield. There is a red thread that connects, as you can see, all these editions. And David, of course, was certainly questioning what, as architect, the collective responsibilities are. So his Biennale is focused on common ground that is clearly between architects and society, but even more maybe between architects themselves. He very explicitly pushes back against the star architect cult, and he asks exhibitors to rather show the references, the collaborations, the shared ideas that underpin their works. So common ground instead of isolated genius. And after a series of exhibitions that illustrate many different ways to approach architecture and the theme of architecture in the contemporary era, so sociological, technological, and urban, it appeared very useful to turn to an architect who has always demonstrated a strong interest in architecture as a discipline and raises questions about the elements that of which architecture is composed, its objectives, its constraints, tools, relationships that connect great masters and younger generations. And so in promoting architecture as a collective culture, David Chipperfield presented nearly 70 projects by architects, photographers, artists, critics, scholars, many of which have responded to his invitation with a collaborative installation that was expressively created for the Biennale. And here you can see always the happy moment of the awards ceremony and some installations by Irish Mateos, Siza, Soto de Mura, and many more. And here are some images of the central pavilion. Rem Koolhaas was an additional shift. Basically, Rem goes back to the fundamentals of the discipline. His first assumption was that we live in a very flat digital world where everything is basically accessible, but increasingly there is less and less memory. So we are condemned almost to some permanent and perpetual present. And fundamental, his exhibition is basically a statement about how much history in the profession still contains, reconstructing how architecture finds itself in its current situation, and also speculating on the future. And he articulates his exhibition in three different but interlocked exhibition. Elements of architecture at the central pavilion that moves away from presenting, let's say, objects, buildings, or architects, and instead focuses on research to show the incredible richness that has been associated historically to these 12 elements: floors, doors, walls, ceiling, and so on and so forth. Each room dedicated to one of the elements. Needless to say that an exhibition without participants is something incredibly difficult to handle from all points of view. This was an enormous series of loans from museums to institutions to industrial realities. And you can imagine that the related fundraising was also enormous. The second section was element of architecture, which was Monditalia in the Arsenale, that is a portrait of Italy that Rem notoriously beloves, through architectural episode displayed in a geographical sequence from south to north, and also intertwined with stages, you can see it in the sketches and the models, that were hosting the dance, music, theater, and cinema activities in a truly fully multidisciplinary approach for the very first time, and I can imagine also the last time in the history of the Biennale. Only Rem could put together all the other directors and coordinate such a huge theatrical machine. And then the third section was absorbing modernity. This was the theme that he launched to all the participating countries to investigate how modernity was absorbed, or rather rejected, in the last 100 years in each nation. So basically the whole exhibition was verging about what are the fundamental components that we all share despite globalization and media saturation. And after Rem, we go to the opposite spectrum of curatorship. So from a master of curatorship, the most sophisticated ultimate thinker, to someone, Alejandro Aravena, who, as he declared very candidly to the president, had never curated anything before in his life, and not even after. Alejandro came up with a completely different approach. Rem had 4 years to prepare his exhibition. Alejandro only had nearly 9 months. He wanted to simply show things that we may be unaware of at that moment. Basically to offer a new point of view like the one that Maria Reiche has on the ladder. The poster was also a very meaningful statement by Aravena. He wanted to have this image that is a photo by Bruce Chatwin of this archaeologist who was going around in the Atacama Desert with an aluminum ladder. First of all, for a sustainable reason, meaning not to waste, not to ruin the land, and secondly, to be able to climb up on the ladder and see from that point of view something that wouldn't make sense from closer, meaning all the lines, all the dots that connected create the famous lines in the desert. So the exhibition is basically about listening to those who are able to gain some perspective and consequently are in the position to share some knowledge and experience with those of us who stand on the ground. And he truly believes that the advancement of architecture is not a goal in itself, but basically a way to improve people's quality of life. And these are some of the examples of installations, starting with the only one, let's say, designed element of the exhibition, which is the first image, where you can see all these strange elements coming down from the ceiling of the Corderie. Basically, this was the only one strong curatorial statement at the entrance of both venues, talking about sustainability and almost, let's say, going through some kind of criticism of the institution that was blessed by President Baratta even. Alejandro was questioning what happens to the infrastructure that is put up to display an art biennale. So the art biennale before him was curated by Okuyenwuzer. He decided to recycle and reuse all the plasterboard that was installed to display the art. Basically, we had people dismounting 10,000 square meters of plasterboards and 14 kilometers of metal stud that you can see here recycled in a quite theatrical way, not without experiments and without discussion on what to do with this material, how to use it in a way that could be could change even the perspective and the way to look at this kind of discarded leftovers. The solution came from a worker who looked once at a piece of plasterboard, put it on the other upside down, and said, well, this looks almost like the travertino dei poveri, the travertine of the poor. And from there, Aravena got the idea, and it transformed it into a super scenographic entrance and also statement for the exhibition. So there is, all in all, a return to the common ground idea that we saw in Chipperfield and Sejima, but this time with a different meaning. So the ground is basically the place where we live, where we act as individuals and society, and also the level from which we can raise our gaze through our sort of expanded eye. So Aravena basically underlines also through the installations how important it is that a qualified demand from individuals and community is met by an equally effective response by the architects. Here you can have some examples of installations. Kunle Adeyemi got, here you can see a version of the Makoko floating school prepared for the Venetian lagoon that was produced off-site and shipped on site. It got the silver lion. Here you can see the masonry arc by Gabinete di Architettura by Solano Benitez. This was another interesting clash between the unskilled workers that he invited from Uruguay and the skilled workers that were supposed to help according to the Italian regulations. And then Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara. Basically, they were invited to curate the 2018 Biennale. And the first task for both of them was to write a manifesto, so a type of philosophical framework. And Free Space, one word, is the title of their exhibition, and it's about generosity. So the capacity of architecture to offer public, inclusive, even unprogrammed spaces. So gifts to the people and the city beyond commercial logic. So these false questions of publicness, of democracy, the right to the city at the very heart of the Biennale. And we can say it's architecture as a social resource rather than a luxury product. They chose to join, to add free to space to create one word, free space, fusing both these aspects together and in the hope that things could be thought about slightly differently, not only from architects and professionals, but also from the users and the public. And then we enter the last chapter of the Architecture Biennale. We could, from 21 until we can say 27, since the Biennale has announced the next curators, that goes from climate age to repair and regeneration. And Roberto Cicutto was appointed the new president. He has to manage the pandemic crisis with both art and architecture postponed by 1 year. So in a context of really unprecedented emergency, he launched his vision for the Biennale as a hub of research for all contemporary arts. And basically, he promoted in the year when nothing was happening because of COVID, the Disquiet Muses, an exhibition that for the first time was curated by all directors of the 6 department of the Venice Biennale, using the Biennale archive and other archives, basically to retrace key moments during the 20th century where the history of the institution overlapped with the history of the world. And he confirmed Hashim Sarkis, that had already been appointed by Paolo Baratta, to curate this very unique edition. The title had been, How Will We Live Together, had been decided before pandemic, and it was quite prophetic, I must say. Hashim Sarkis basically had to face, this was my last year as managing director of the Art and Architecture department. I was still there when it started, and we had already secured the organization, the budget, the fundraising, everything. All of a sudden, overnight, imagine the price of the transports was tripled, was skyrocketing. We had to start all over again to fundraise, to reorganize, and to also find new dynamics, how to deal with this unprecedented situation with all the architects struggling. The answer was by collaborating. So we started, basically a year lost in a way was a year gained in many different ways. We started to understand how we could, let's say, coordinate the transports, and in order to use less containers, to share the costs, how to shift, to move the production of many elements from the original countries of the architect to Venice, so to avoid shipping, to have things produced on site. And Hashim structured his exhibition into 5 different scales: the body, the household, the community, transborder regions, and the planet. And basically, he claimed that the conventional scales of the past biennales, meaning architecture and the city, miss out on those scales where we are seeing the more radical changes in our practice and in our times, meaning the scale of the body and the scale of the planets. So architecture basically is becoming, in this exhibition, an arena for coexistence, for geopolitics, for climate migration, for new social contracts. And in Hashim's vision, architecture is basically no longer framing and shaping urban life, but instead life itself, and we can say human and non-human, is the content where architecture is just becoming a mediating tool. And finally, Leslie Locco. Leslie represents also a shift, a geographical shift of the point of view that Cicutto wanted to put in place. For art, with the appointment of Adriano Pedrosa from Brazil, and architecture with Leslie Locco from Ghana. She chose 2 keywords, basically, to shape the response of the practitioners: decarbonization and decolonization. She focused on Africa as a unique context, both challenging, of course, and creative, as a place where we can, from which to examine all issues that dominate and will dominate the next century. So climate change, societal change, demographic change, new forms of governance, and explosive urbanization. And in this sense, she calls her exhibition a laboratory. So laboratory is not meant to be a place for a scientific and precise experimentation, but rather a very messy and passionate space for human inquiry. This is what she basically launched to the participants. So if a radical shift that we can see in three different focuses. So center Africa as the world's laboratory, frame architecture as storytelling and material practice, and then recast the architect as a civil actor. So not just a building designer, but basically architects, activists, filmmakers, researchers, community organizers, they were all seen and treated as architectural practitioners. Basically, the participants were voices that were not typically heard in global exhibitions and less on the Biennale stages, but they were really proposing works and in a sequence of very diverse installations displayed within an overall infrastructure that fully reuses that of the art exhibition of the previous year. So Leslie just repainted the walls, but basically didn't change any partition, any element. And finally, the current cycle of the Biennale. Pietrangelo Buttafuoco was appointed president in 2004 after Cicutto, and he reconfirms the vision of the Biennale and of Venice as a local model to be interpreted at a global scale. So this double perspective is constantly present in his choices of the new curators. So 2025, this year's architecture exhibition Carlo Ratti, the next Art Biennale with Koyo Kuo, and the 2027 Architecture Biennale with Wan Shu and Lu Wengyu. I'm sure that most of you will have seen or read about Carlo Ratti's exhibition. Basically, for decades, architectural response to the climate crisis has been centered on mitigation. So designing to reduce our impact on the climate. But this approach is no longer enough. So Carlo claims that the time has come for architecture to embrace adaptation, rethinking how we design for an altered world through a fundamental shift in the practice. So he invites different types of intelligence, natural, artificial, and collective, to work together to rethink the built environment. And here you can see more than a call for proposals, it's more the call for proposal rather than a traditional architecture exhibition. His Biennale showcased an unprecedented number of participants, each sharing at different scales their research, methodology, experiments through different scales, materials, and media. And I couldn't think of a better way to conclude this presentation than presenting, and this requires another applause. This is the second Bahrain participation to be awarded the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale. So like in 2010, it doesn't exhibit just a concept. It presents like a fully inhabitable prototype, in this case of passing cooling strategies, that is inspired by the Bahrain architecture, but reimagined for modern contemporary context and extreme climate conditions. So the best interpretation that was awarded the Golden Lion as the best pavilion this year. Thank you so much.